onto the ACLU's Facebook. And here we are. So hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to our Testimony Tuesday summer series from the ACLU of Missouri. This is our third and final in the series, where we will be having a panel discussion with Judge Wolff, with Representative Paula Brown from St. Louis and Ashley Bland-Manlove from Kansas City. Danielle and I are your hosts from the ACLU. Danielle, you want to go ahead and give an intro?
Yes. Hi, I'm Danielle Spradley. I'm the Communications Associate with the ACLU of Missouri. I've been here my pronouns are she, hers, and I've been here for almost 2 years now. Paula, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Paula Brown, pronouns she, her. I am a retired educator, 31 years from the Hazelwood School District. This is my third year in the House, and I represent District 70 that runs from Hazelwood through Bridgeton, Maryland Heights, Creve Coeur, Chesterfield, and St. Charles.
Places
thanks for having me.
Real and exist. Yep. Ashley, I'm sorry, Representative Bland-Manlove, would you like to go ahead and go next?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. My name is State Representative Ashley Bland-Manlove. I represent a chunk of Jackson County, Kansas City, Cleaver 2 to 99th, Holmes to Prospect. And I'm also chair of the Missouri Legislative Black Caucus. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And Judge Wolff, do you mind rounding us out with, I could never do your intro justice anyway, so if you want to round us out.
I'm Mike Wolff. I served on the Missouri Supreme Court for 13 years, and I've been a teacher and a dean at St. Louis University Law School, and I've failed retirement many times, including now.
And we are thankful for your time, even in the midst of retirement. So as you can see, we've gathered a lovely panel to discuss critical race theory with you this evening. My name is Mel Duvlar. I am the Legislative Associate with the ACLU of Missouri out of our Kansas City office. However long Danielle said she works here, ditto for me because we got hired the same week. So we have been here chugging along for a couple of years here and a couple of sessions, which gave us a little bit of unique insight on what they're doing right now as far as critical race theory is concerned. So let's jump right in and give a little bit of a definition to inform the conversation that we are about to have. Critical race theory and 1619 Project. Whatever you have heard on the news, whatever you have read in the newspapers or on social medias is probably hyperbolic on what actual CRT theories and concepts are. It is, in its actual sense, critical race theory is an academic concept that was developed in law schools through legal scholars' work to look at how some of our laws and institutions have been shaped by racism and how that has been baked into a lot of our systems and continue to impact people today. And how these systems continue to promote inequality and some of the gaps that we see. And we'll have some conversations about that, both historically and currently. And then the 1619 Project specifically was a project developed by a professor named Nicole Hannah-Jones, and who is now teaching at Howard University, proud Bison, and the New York Times, which tried to develop some sort of historical not retelling, but historical telling from a different perspective, something that has not been done previously to the magnitude and to the wide acclaim and criticism that it has been recently, that tries to place the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans truly at the center of a lot of our historical conversations and perspectives. This specific piece of work is something that the legislature has tried to ban specifically, and is something that is included in some school districts in the state, including Kansas City, Hazelwood, and one more. So that is the not scary what it is that we're talking about piece of the conversation. The topic at hand is this. How has it played out in our Missouri government thus far? In the 2021 legislative session, there were 3 proposals made. I'm sorry, in the 2021 legislative session, there were 2 proposals made. One to ban CRT altogether and one to ban 1619 projects being used in curriculums across the state. One was heard in a committee, one was brought up on the floor. And so there have been a couple of different ways that this has been brought into play in the State House. And another bill was introduced in the special session that was intended to ban the teaching of divisive concepts. In some of these hearings, we've heard conversations from opponents of critical race theory saying that it perpetuates stereotypes or assigns blames for societal problems or ills for things in the past that people living currently either had no participation in, or I think the more egregious part is have no continued benefit from. The piece that is missing from that part of the opposition conversation. What I'm going to put on the screen right now as I start to pass around some questions are examples of the actual legislation that was introduced this year. I say it's from bad to worse. The first one, like I said, was banning the 1619 project. Technical legislative language, but basically no one would be able to use this piece of work to incorporate it into their curriculum. We have seen in other states, this has gone as far as teachers possibly seeing fines for teaching these things in their schools. So we haven't seen things to that extent yet in Missouri, but this is a conversation going on across the nation and continuing to kind of go around the boundaries of what is appropriate in this setting, and how do you punish teachers for doing those things? We'll get into those questions in a moment. The second one was the divisive concepts. That is a piece that says no one should feel discomfort or guilt for the things that they learn in history class, and that no ills of the past can be assigned to a certain category of people or to a certain action that has been taken from the government, for example, or from our institutions. That is a little bit broader than the first one and presents its own version of issues. And then the absolute worst one is an amendment that was added to, they attempted to add to a bill for vulnerable persons. This one is the broadest, and it would not allow any curriculum to identify people, institutions as systemically racist, sexist, biased, privileged, or oppressed. You cannot classify persons into groups for any purpose. This is so broad and wide-reaching. It would essentially ban the teaching of anything across the country and across the world of our history. How would you teach South African apartheid? How would you teach the Holocaust, slavery, just transatlantic slavery? Just a wide breadth of topics would be completely dismissed. I don't even know how we would have history classes at this point if some of these versions were to be implemented into our state curriculum and state how our state thinks and how we promote our education and how we promote having our children educated. So with that, I'm gonna toss to my first question for our educator on the panel, Paula, to give us a little bit of education about the education system that we have in Missouri. As an educator, why do some of these proposals that have been introduced in the bill specifically and the overall topic, why does that trouble you in an educator sense?
So there are several reasons why this would trouble any educator, especially in today's world. First of all, what we need to know is that the legislators worked on work groups to determine what the state standards were. That's what we teach from, is the state standards. My concern is they created state standards. Now they don't like them, evidently, at least some of them don't. So we're going to have the state government interfering in what should be local control. Local control should be able to use the materials that they want to teach the standards that have been decided upon by us. That's one thing. But Missouri suffers from enough teachers in the state. Not only do we pay some of the lowest pay in the country, but now we're going to say you can be fined if you teach certain things. That is not a way to attract teachers. But the censorship of what children hear in a classroom, that is unforgivable. We will not teach our kids to have honesty or integrity if they don't know the full truth of our history. It is glorious and ugly all at the same time. But until they know it, until they understand it, we will die away and they will be doomed to repeat it.
Oh, you make absolute critical point. And you know, to bring it to some of the language, someone to not be made to feel uncomfortable. I always use my own example. I grew up in Missouri. I went to school in public schools in Missouri, and no one asked me how comfortable I felt when my classmates constantly and repeatedly in the same class mispronounced the Niger River over and over and over again, to the point I had to raise my hand and ask the teacher for correction on what was happening. No one asked me about my levels of discomfort or anyone else's implied guilt or what they were you know, saying or messaging with the things that they were doing in those conversations. So you know, how do we police some of those things when only certain people's views and feelings are taken into account? And I am going to toss that into the next question of who is the one who decides what is taught as history in our schools and what is not. You briefly mentioned some of the textbooks and standards and curriculum that is. Do you mind touching on that once more?
Oh, not at all. So curriculum, so it's at one point we had Common Core, which was to be able to allow kids to be able to go from state to state, military families, things like that, who moved often, so that kids could stay even with their education. In the state of Missouri, they didn't like Common Core, so Common Core was abandoned. So that's when the legislators were pulled together in their work groups to create the standards that we teach today. They go from pre-K to 12. I can't speak intelligently about higher ed, but so we create those standards. They're pushed out into the school districts. The school districts have curriculum committees and textbook committees and just supplementary material committees. And they're to choose from things that will help them teach the standards that the legislature has said they should be teaching. The standards have not changed and they're not going to change. So let's, for pretend's sake, a bill passes and it goes into effect August 28th, 2022. That is not enough time for school districts to rearrange their syllabuses, their materials, or anything else. It also cuts out most material that is available. We just got textbooks in the last 15 years to just start touching on the real history of the world, the honest and open history. And now what we're saying is we don't want that anymore. We don't want anybody's feelings to be hurt. And so the legislature is going to set up school districts and teachers and kids for failure. And that will, I can't even fathom what that will actually do to the state of education at that point. And I have to be honest, I've been working so hard fighting it that I hadn't given thought beyond that point, and it just took my breath away.
Yeah. So. Yeah. No, it is staggering actually how far this could reach out. And so I want to toss some of the conversation over to our other panelists to talk a little bit about that. You know, the conversations that we're having and that they are trying to have banned in our schools include some of the things listed on the screen. It's a pretty heavy lift. You know, like was mentioned previously, we need to look at our past or else we may be doomed to repeat our mistakes. There is a just litany of things I will allow the rest of the panelists to choose and discuss as they see fit. But there was a recent article today, actually, on the Mo Times that had some of these statistics about the gaps in our racial disparities in a number of different areas. You know, elementary school suspensions, that's something that at the ACLU, we've worked really hard to try to stop suspensions from K through third grade. We find that you know, minorities, specifically Black children and children with disabilities are the ones that are most affected by, disproportionately affected by that. Children in foster care are disproportionately Black children. Children that are certified as adults, another fight that we recently had in the State House, are overwhelmingly Black or more represented than the rest of the population. So I'm going to first start with Representative Manlove. Can you just talk to us a little bit about this historical perspective as the Black Caucus Chair? You know, you have history within your own legislature and within your own group. how would the legislature even talk about the legislative Black Caucus if we are unable to talk about some of these things?
Right. How we talk about the Black Caucus, because there'd be no reason for a Black Caucus if everybody was fair and heard. So that's a great point that I hadn't thought about. Unfortunately, I just had a death in the family, so I just thought I saw a lot of family. And I finally got to see a family picture that for a long time had been cut in half. And so we finally got to put the full picture together. And one of the young ladies pictured in the picture is my great 3 times back grandmother, who was found as a baby on the Trail of Tears, which was state sanctioned, genocide essentially, and relocation. So that was an order from the state, and I don't know how we would talk about that, and I don't know how I would learn my own family history if we were not able to talk about some of these more divisive topics. I'm sure, Mo, the one you were hinting towards was me being part of the LGBTQIA plus family. And, that started with the riots. So, and actually, I was just having a conversation with a friend about how what we call studs in the lesbian community, how they were started, which was actually out of self-protection, because in the 20s and 30s, when the times were good and women were actually out with other women who were dressed both as women, people would kill them and beat them and harass them and rape them. So one started dressing as a male to physically protect them. I don't know how I would talk about that. And the 1619 Project almost changed my life. I would say it definitely gave me a broader perspective, because the 1619 Project is really about the economic effect and how slavery really built the economic background of America. To one point, slavery having, the highest, kind of grossing commerce than any other industry in the United States at the time. So I don't know how we would talk about that. Like, where did the money come from that built all these great empires? This is not the book burning. This is all this is. This is book burning and state censorship. So we have done this time and time again. Nazi Germany, Stalin, Russia, Saddam Hussein, great tyrants of the world who needed to control the narrative, because when we know that people are have a solid education, you cannot impose really oppression upon them. But somebody has to win and somebody wants power. So, and just like you mentioned, any book in the US written before 1990, I say, because I know my elementary school books did not mention anybody but Harriet Tubman and Martin Luther King. I didn't even, know George Washington Carver, who was from Missouri, until I was in high school and had gone to a Black centered school. So, I think that this is appalling and an abomination, but I think that it's a play that has constantly been ran throughout history. So if we galvanize, we can definitely stop it like we have before.
Absolutely. No, you bring up a lot of good points, and I don't want to speed past some of those historical relevant pieces. I mean, Trail of Tears, some of the riots, Stonewall, general oppression, even up to we just ended Don't Ask, Don't Tell in the military.
In the military, correct. That ended right before I actually got out, right before I went to basic training. 2 months before I went to basic training, that was repealed. So yeah, my whole military experience either wouldn't have happened or would have been completely different.
Yeah, and that's something that's happening in our lifetime. And Judge Wolff, I would never guess your age, but I know you have wisdom to impart on all of us. So I toss it to you a little bit on some of those historical and legal examples that come into play within this conversation.
I'll start by reflecting off of Representative Manlove's comment about book burning by quoting from a very famous Republican Dwight David Eisenhower, President of the United States, not so many years ago when we were burning books in the 1950s. And here's what President Eisenhower had to say. He said, "Don't join the book burners. Don't think you're going to conceal faults by concealing evidence that they ever existed. Don't be afraid to go in your library and read every book." Now, I don't know what the modern Republicans would think of President Eisenhower, but that is something. The critical race theory is a very interesting phenomenon in that I first heard about it about 40 years ago in academia. And it was, as you mentioned, started by some law professors who wanted to look at legal history in a different way. And because, and let me make a distinction here. We study discrimination, we study racial things like the Brown versus Board of Education decision. We have legislation in Missouri and in the federal system that allows people to sue for employment discrimination and other kinds of discrimination based on race. As a judge, I enforced the Batson requirement, which says you can't kick somebody off a jury because of their race. But what critical race theory was talking about was not those individual things, but the structure of the legal system. And that is, that's a different kind of thing. So when I first heard about critical race theory, I asked, well, what is it? And I heard the explanation. In fact, you'll get different explanations from different people who propound it. And I said, oh, it's history. Because I think history is a very deep and nuanced and interesting thing. And the question you always have to ask about history as it is taught is it factual? Is it propaganda? Is it something to make us feel good about our country by telling some stuff that maybe isn't true? You've made, I think Representative Brown made a reference and there was another reference to the idea that those who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. That's from the Spanish-born American philosopher George Santayana. He also said something a little bit more dark. He said, history is a pack of lies about events that never happened, told by people who weren't there. So what we're seeing between those two things, just from one person, is that history consists of narratives, and they're competing narratives oftentimes. And let me give you one kind of current example. Haiti, which was a slave colony of France, and it had the first and only successful slave revolt in history. And it went from 1790 to about 1804. And they drove the French out of Haiti. Now, in the southern United States, that terrified the plantation owners because they were afraid that there were going to be slave revolts in the United States. And in fact, there was one in Louisiana in, I think, 1810. I don't think you ever studied that in your history. Okay, and it was almost successful, but it was not. And so we're kind of selective about this thing. But about Haiti specifically, the Reverend Pat Robertson, he of the 700 Club, white evangelical, in 2010, when Haiti was struck by the previous devastating earthquake, he said, and I found the thing from CNN, he said that Haitians were under the heel of the French, Napoleon III and whatever. And he said, and they all got together and they swore a pact to the devil. They said, we will serve you, the devil, if you will get us free from the French. True story, says Reverend Robertson. And so the devil said, okay, it's a deal. So throughout the American South and the plantation society was the notion that all the bad things that happened to Haiti are because of the slave revolt. That's remarkable. You can't even, you don't even need to use words like racism for that kind of thing. But that is a narrative that exists. There's another narrative that, sometimes we teach history in high school And I have a friend who went to a suburban St. Louis high school who told me that her history class was taught from the perspective of the South as the lost cause. Well, that's interesting. Was it a good cause?
That's
Was
interesting.
slavery a good cause? Was that a good thing? So the other thing so critical race theory, in whatever iteration you want to take it, does try to address those kinds of things that are about the system and about how people approach those things. And I'll just stop because I've got lots of stuff I could talk about. But
Oh, we'll come back to you, Judge Wolff. No worries.
you can do that. But I was recently studying a book about Shakespeare in the United States. And it was, and the abolitionists of Boston, they were in favor of abolishing slavery, but did they accept white supremacy? And there's an anecdote in there about John Quincy Adams, who was very much an abolitionist,
Mhm.
who was at a dinner party with a British actress. And he said he found that Othello, in which, of course, it involves a black man
Mhm.
in love with a white woman, he found it disgusting.
Mhm.
So that was from the liberals, if you
Mhm.
will. And of course, in Europe and in the United Kingdom, Othello was usually played by a person of African descent, mostly. In the United States, never until Paul Robertson in the 20th century.
Mhm.
And people could study Shakespeare in the United States without even knowing that Othello, unless you paid attention to Shakespeare's language, you wouldn't know that he was black.
Mhm. Now you bring up a good point that I want to highlight, and that is going back to some of the conversation with Representative Brown about who decides what gets taught. So I am a nerd and I still like listening to college lectures all the time. And I do so frequently, and was recently doing one about women in history, or women journalists in history, and listened to the entire thing without a single conversation about Ida B. Wells covering lynchings in the South, to her great detriment and horror and bodily harm. Connie Chung in the 90s coming, on TV. Even just women, when women were allowed to there are levels of history that are kept from us. And like Judge Wolff mentioned, there are a number of pieces of that history we never know. So even before the conversation of CRT, which is by and large not being taught in our schools, can you talk to us a little bit about the problems that we currently have in our school districts? I mean, we are pretty low in our educational funding for the nation. I know some school district in some rural areas that can't run 5 days a week because they don't have the means to be able to teach school or give kids, keep the lights on or give kids food. Are there some other areas and topics that maybe some of our focus would be better spent on at this point, to help our kids be actually educated in this moment right now?
So you mean other than this made up topic that they're pushing? Absolutely. We should talk about funding for transportation. Transportation should be funded according to our rules. They want to try to be at 75%. Last 2 years, I think we averaged 17 and 19% reimbursement. So when school districts don't get reimbursed for their transportation, all of that money comes from their general fund, which directly impacts programming, which means that's what touches kids. Secondly, everybody wants to brag about us fully funding the formula. It's easy to fully fund a formula when you change the formula and then lop off $400 million of it.
Exactly right.
It's
Been doing it for years. Yes.
For years.
Mhm.
And so, and just an additional fun fact, Missouri, and I want to say Vermont, I could be wrong, but it's a northeastern state, the only two states in the country who fund public education the way we do.
Mhm.
And oh, by the way, casinos and the lottery are
Mhm.
carrying a lion's share of supporting our public education. We have been an afterthought since the 20s. And let me take one step further. In the 20s and 30s, when St. Louis School District became an entity. Most people don't know that that was the model school district for the country.
Mhm.
Everything west of the Mississippi modeled itself on St. Louis public schools. Kindergarten, smaller class sizes, that well-ventilated buildings, water in the buildings. They even had a few wraparound services at that time because there was such a discrepancy in income that the world marveled at the way we did it.
Mhm.
And so we know how to do things right in Missouri. We literally just choose not to. We choose not to.
Mhm.
Can I pick
We-
up on that point? I'm sorry.
No, please go.
We fund schools locally, which we have done historically. And then we added state funding into
Mhm.
it. But we still rely upon the property tax of local school districts
Mhm.
as the means by raising, I think it's about half of the several $billion that we spend on elementary and secondary education. And so there's a lot of compromises that are made around that in terms of local control. But now the legislature looks like it's going to get into the curriculum development business. Well, if the legislature is going to do that, then it ought to pay for it. I mean, how can you come to the table and demand to be in charge if you're not even funding enough adequacy in education to even get there, to even do 5 days of school a week and at a certain level, no matter how poor the school district and the people in the school district are. I mean, we have extraordinary disparities that are not justified by anything other than the belief that some children might be more valuable than other children. And that's really what we're saying with our school funding.
It
And
is.
we can't do that.
So the rest of the country gives a certain amount to every student in their state by states. That's what typically happens. We have a state adequacy target, but then we expect that the local localities will raise enough money to finish funding whatever programs and the amount of teachers they need for that particular area. Right now, Missouri averages 36% of state funding. I mean, state funding is about 36% of what school districts get. We have districts at the minimum tax rate, $2 and some change, and I apologize, I can't remember the exact number. And you're talking about places that cannot raise their taxes. They don't have enough people. They don't have enough jobs. They don't have enough people coming in and through for tourism. They cannot raise it. They can't afford to pay any higher. So we have the Claytons of the world who are blessed and they have a tax rate and they spend 17 per kid. I could be wrong on that. And we have others who spend state adequacy plus 2.3%. So the disparity when we talk about our rural schools, because our rural schools, nobody wants to understand that our rural schools suffer as much or more than our urban schools. You're right. They go to school 4 days a week. The teachers come in 5 days a week, but the kid, and that's not a bad thing, but kids only in school for 4 days a week. Think about the loss of instructional time. Now let's add the 2 weeks that they lose for instructional time for the MAP program. So that's a lot of lost instructional time. Of course, where there's going to be a disparity in their learning. Rationally, you can't even begin to think that they might be getting an equal education. They are not. So our funding mechanism needs to be addressed. It should have been addressed 20 years ago or more. And most people don't like the personal property tax. I don't blame them. I don't like writing that check on December 30th. But I do love my public schools and I love my fire department and I love my police department. I like them all to be able to come back to work. But we've got to figure out a different way to fund public education. It is not working.
Yeah.
By the way, to take you back to critical race theory, it seems to me, and as I've been looking at some of the things that you distributed, Mo, that this is a distraction.
Yeah.
Let's focus on
Mhm.
something that most people don't understand.
Mhm,
I mean, just the name critical, does
mhm.
that mean we're criticizing the United States? No. No, critical is one of those academic words, and you put it on a course title so that people say, oh, that's going to be interesting or important or something like that.
Or hard.
Or hard.
Meaning in-depth thought.
In-depth thought. Thank you.
In-depth thought, like critical thinking, which they try to
That's
teach
right.
us in middle school.
That's what we're trying to teach, critical thinking. We're not doing a very good job of it if people believe some of the crap that they're throwing around about critical race theory, but they needed a counter narrative to the strong narrative that developed basically after the George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement and the events out of Ferguson and so forth, that really drove a narrative about race that was much more visible. And so you reach down into the academic cellar and pull out, and it is kind of in the cellar. I mean, schools don't spend a heck of a lot of money on teaching critical race theory. Trust me, I've been in legal education for a long time. And so you just pull this thing out and say, hey, look at this. They're trying to teach kids how to hate each other or hate themselves or some other damn thing. And it just isn't true. But, you know, the other one thing that kind of impresses me is that, you know, I've always heard that history was written by the winners,
Mhm.
but the army that surrendered at Appomattox are the ones that are writing our history now,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, that happened. Okay, so it's kind of an, you know, like, so the Confederacy really has captured the narrative because much of the narrative is about race.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
we have to understand that. So when people say, oh, look over here, don't pay attention to what Representative Brown is saying about school funding. The heck with that. We're going to make our children learn not to whatever, feel bad about being white or whatever the heck the goal of it is. And that's, you know, it is mostly a distraction.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I want to bring the conversation back to what is happening on the ground with some of it. It is a distraction, as Representative Brown has just told us. There are a number of other things that we could be concerning ourselves with in education. And so I was wondering if Representative Manlove, you could talk a little bit about the conversations in the State House, how they shaped up for this distraction. Like we discussed, these bills were not pre-filed last session. These were not things that were, you know, this conversation obviously has gotten some oxygen across the country and nationwide in the abstract with some people in the big Congress in DC. But on the ground, as it's happening, it was, like I said, added to an amendment on the floor. So there was no public discussion on that version of it. The one that was brought up during special session was not within the bounds of what was called for that special session and therefore was not discussed, but was important enough to be filed anyways in the midst of something, knowing that they were never going to talk about it. Can you just talk to us about, you know, as this came up in the Capitol and what movement we can expect maybe, and how some people may be able to prepare for that coming in the next session?
Yeah, this kind of it has been a distraction, and it kind of shifted focus because what we were talking about before was guns in schools and teachers' pay and teachers' minimum wage, and whether the private schools or whether just the teachers or janitors, some very base teacher pensions, you know, those are normally the narrative. So this did kind of come out of nowhere after George Floyd. It was a clear backlash to George Floyd, and then Biden on top of that. So they just, there was all this talk about all of a sudden communism or something, or these crazy liberals in the Capitol are gonna come, you know, steal your guns, and then now they're gonna teach your poor little white kids that they're evil, which is not the point. So I see this moving forward. Normally when they get really riled up about something, it doesn't stop until the Supreme Court tells them that it has to stop. So I see all three of these bills being now pre-filed for the upcoming session in January and being, you know, fast-tracked right on through. I'm just hoping that there are enough people who can, see through this facade. But there's so much old, race bait stoking kind of fear going on right now. And you're right, Judge Wolff, there's a lot of reminiscence. There's been a lot of talk about Gone with the Wind again. And as a young kid watching that, I didn't understand that they were talking about, oh, the Confederates were the good guys.
They were the good guys.
Okay. So I feel a lot of that. And, everybody forgets that Missouri is the most northern southern state. Missouri was a slave state. And so I see a lot of, oh, well, the rebel flag is just my history. Going to be a strong narrative for this upcoming session.
Yeah. No, you brought up a very good point. I'm actually about to toss to you, Judge Wolff, because she brought up a very good point about they will not stop until it gets to the Supreme Court. Even in a session this year that they finally, in one of our worst Supreme Court decisions ever, condemned the Dred Scott decision that had to be fought all the way to the Supreme Court, that then got like it was bad all the way around.
Too soon, wasn't it?
And I joke, how would they even teach about the fact that they passed a condemnation of something that we're not allowed to teach about? How would you even tell people how you did your job that day? So Judge Wolff, I would like to toss to you a little bit on that legal side. If this passes, what is, I'm assuming it would get challenged. I'm assuming this would have to go up through the courts. I truly have not given that side of the legal pathway as much. It scares me to consider.
It's what's so interesting about this, and I'll get to your question in a moment, is that Missouri has really been central to the struggle over race. I mean, we were the state that stayed in the Union, but barely.
Missouri Compromise.
Yes, and the Dred Scott case came out of St. Louis, and because we were one of two states that allowed slaves to sue for their freedom, and in prior cases before Dred and Harriet Scott brought their case, the Missouri Supreme Court was quite willing to say that if you had been traveling in a free state, that you had been therefore declared to be free. They changed, and the Missouri courts changed in the lead up to the Civil War because there was a lot of fighting about slavery and so forth. But in our state, we are still fighting the Civil War. In the Civil War, there's a comedian from St. Louis named Kathleen Madigan, who said that in the Civil War, our motto was fight local. And probably one of the better known examples of that. Now, you study history and Jesse James is a hero, right? In the cowboy and Indian sense or whatever. Jesse James got his start as a 14-year-old boy in his brother's gang, going around knocking on the door of Union sympathizers and shooting them to death. He was a psychopathic killer at age 14. Okay, so that's one of your heroes, okay? Although later after the Civil War, the governor did put a bounty on Jesse James.
I'm pretty sure he has a bust in the Capitol, though. Like,
right, absolutely famous
Great man.
Missourian.
Yeah.
I also the Dred Scott case really led to the Civil War because it declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, and it said that the Congress had no power to ban slavery any place, and that when slaves went to even free states, that free states were obligated to respect the notions of property.
Because there were no rights that a white man was entitled to recognize within a black man.
Exactly. Now, one of the things that I dug around when I did a lecture some years ago about the Dred Scott case was that I found some correspondence from President Lincoln. Writing to somebody to one of his friends in Missouri. And he said, and he didn't have very many friends in Missouri, I might add. He said, "It is very painful to me that you in Missouri cannot or will not settle your factional quarrel among yourselves. I have been tormented with it beyond endurance for months by both sides. Neither side pays the least respect to my appeals to your reason." So I would have to say that Lincoln never did understand Missouri politics and probably didn't live long enough to figure it out.
I bet
So-
you he didn't win the state either, though.
Yeah. So so to go back to the Dred Scott case for a moment, Lincoln's analysis of the Dred Scott case in his debate with Stephen Douglas in 1858 when they were running against each other for the United States Senate, and that was his famous House Divided speech, because basically what he said was that the Dred Scott case made it inevitable that you would have to either have states leave the Union or have a civil war. I mean, that's Lincoln foresaw that. Now, in the Dred Scott case itself, part of that was kind of sponsored by the people who came to be the owners of Dred and Harriet Scott. And when they lost their case in the United States Supreme Court, the Below family released them from bondage. But here's the next thing. And by the way, Dred Scott only lived to about another year or so, but Harriet lived into about 20 more years, 25 more years. They had to post a $1,000 bond as free blacks to live in St. Louis County, which included the city. That was before the Great Divorce. So imagine this, if you had to pay, and a $1,000 bond in 1860 or 1858 is equivalent to $33,000 today. So if you were a free black in St. Louis County, you had to post a bond of $33,000. And that's all done through the legal system. I found the bond that the Below family had posted for Harriet and Dred Scott. So even when you have kind of good people, and let me go back one point to the critical race theory business, because they had to bring this up as kind of a distraction. But the critical race theory is very pointed about liberals too, because the liberal idea is that we're colorblind, and the critical race theory scholars reject that notion. What do you mean we're colorblind? We're all going to be the same. I mean, when the Supreme Court of the United States struck down the parts of the Voting Rights Act case in 2013 in the Shelby County case, Chief Justice Roberts said, well, it's over. Basically, we've got a black president, racism is over. One of my colleagues, Joel Goldstein, wrote a really nice critique of that, and the title of it is very telling. He called it "Not Hearing History." That's what he called what Roberts did, not hearing history. They want to ignore history. And by the way, that's where and I think when you look at the Supreme Court of the United States, you think, well, did the Confederacy lose the war or not?
Well, they want to tell it from a certain perspective and from certain experiences. The craziest thing to me about Chief Justice Roberts is he's never been pulled over. And when he writes about how it is a de minimis intrusion on someone's day, when he does not know, he has no idea what it feels like to be pulled over, and yet he is ruling over and had to get a smackdown from Sotomayor, the only one who has criminal experience on the court right now, to say you don't know what it is like to have your heart beating as a black or brown person and not know truly why this is happening right now, how this will end, and what direction this goes in, whether you leave with yourself, your property, your liberty, or your life. There are completely different education or experiences that people are trying to apply to this overall education system. And this pushback on history is not looking at it through a racial or sexist or any other type of lens. It is truly just getting more perspectives on history from people that have been there, that have lived it, and we're seeing the outcomes of some of that now. I want to just touch briefly back with Paula, with Representative Brown, because you have seen some of these perspectives as an educator. Your classrooms were filled with Black and Brown students in some of your education spaces. Do you mind just talking a little bit about how you've seen some of their lives, neighborhoods, communities, cultures impacted how we can celebrate those in schools without having people feel uncomfortable, or how we are able to really incorporate what is needed for these kids to have the type of education that can propel them to be great Missourians and great citizens?
Well, first of all, the first thing kids require, and every parent on earth will tell you this, they require the truth,
Mm-hmm.
period. We celebrate the glories and we call out the ugliness. Kids are so much better than adults about recognizing what should be celebrated and what should not.
Mm-hmm.
We should really take our lead from them. I raised 2 boys who went through the same school system that I taught in.
Mm-hmm.
So as educators, what we need to do first and foremost is celebrate everyone's uniqueness and difference, because it brings so much to the table.
Mm-hmm.
It so much to learn. My personal experience is odd at best. I grew up in North County, but a part of North County that didn't think it was North County. But I have literally been in District 70 for 40 years. And so when I started teaching, I was all the way over in Blackjack. I don't know if everybody knows what Blackjack, St. Louis County is, but I taught at Keevan and Jury Elementary over in unincorporated, and then Blackjack, and then in Florissant. So with the kiddos that I worked with the most, they were like every other class in the United States. We had children who had struggles. We had children who were brilliant. We had children who were less than brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
We had parents who were, who struggled, who worked 2 jobs, who couldn't find a job. We had $250,000 houses in 1986 in Blackjack, Missouri.
Mm-hmm.
It was a well-to-do, mostly Black and brown population over there. So when we celebrated, it was about our community. Our community focus is really important when it comes to celebrating diversity and inclusion and acceptance. It's not something you can take for granted. And for people, I loved it when Judge Wolff talked about the liberals and we don't see color. Holy smokes. If I'd have said that, I would have failed in year 3. By year 3, I would have been doing something different. I'd have been in law school or doing something different. So what we need to do is learn from each other. I reached out to the Black and brown moms and said, okay, I'm going to be terrible at this if I don't get some help from you all. They helped me. So what we do when we celebrate is we celebrate the fact that people reach out to one another, and that we do include each other, and that we bond over our struggles. We celebrate over our wins. And that's all kids want. Tell me the truth. It can be hard and it can be ugly, but tell it to me so that I know what I'm looking at next time.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we don't, aside from dooming ourselves, we are setting kids up to not recognize the joys and the sorrows that could come.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask a question, or maybe a point that will take you back, maybe past your childhood even? And that is, in 1954, the United States Supreme Court, as we know, in Brown versus Board of Education, said that you couldn't, blacks and whites could be educated together. The Missouri Constitution at that time, and from Reconstruction on, forbade the education of blacks and whites together in the same classrooms, right?
Right.
You know when the voters of Missouri actually repealed that? I voted in that election. It was 1976. So 22 years after Brown versus Board of Education, we passed a constitutional amendment. No, it wasn't. I mean, our constitutional provision was invalid because of Brown versus Board of Education, but that was still on our books.
It's never stopped us from doing bad things.
The neighborhood that I live in had a trustee, as one of those subdivision things with a Caucasian thing in it. Somebody actually read the thing several years ago and
restrictive covenant in his house.
got it taken out. Yeah, I mean, this was and that those racial restrictive covenants were thrown out by the US Supreme Court in a Missouri case in 1948. So we change gradually.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Go ahead, Paula.
let me throw this in. When I first started teaching, they used to take us on a bus and they took us on a tour. Well, I grew up in North County, so and I lived over there. I lived near Blackjack. And so we go on this bus tour and we're looking at all the neighborhoods and knowing where all the districts are. And it was really cool. But we got to it. I don't know how many people know of Laramore Elementary. It's one of the elementary schools on our far east side. It's our farthest east at the time. And it was really interesting because all the surrounding schools were filled with Black and brown faces. And this particular school had all white faces. It was just this little group of houses. And I was like, how does that work? Remember, I'm naive. I grew up in an area that didn't think it was North County. And they said, oh, well, family just sells the houses to the next generation. And so it's just the same families who've lived there for years and years and years. I accepted that because I didn't know any better. But as I started working through all of the things that you start learning as an educator, I was like, holy smokes, we had our own little piece of restrictive, what did you call it?
Covenants.
Covenants. And
I don't know that it was in written, but it just happened.
Mhm.
And that neighborhood didn't change for probably halfway through my career.
Mhm.
It was amazing. It was an amazing learning experience for me.
Absolutely.
you want to know something about Blackjack?
Yes.
Blackjack was incorporated in order to pass zoning to exclude low-income people, particularly Blacks. And the United
That would
States,
explain the houses.
then the United States Justice Department filed a lawsuit. Again, a part of our Missouri legal history, which nobody pays much attention to anymore. And so the Blackjack case became very well known around the country because the government then was using the fairly recently enacted civil rights laws to bust up that kind of because they incorporated and they did it with racial intent, right? To keep out. So there's a whole lot of that. I mean, many of the major civil rights cases in the United States history came out of Missouri,
Yes,
and it's not
absolutely.
an accident.
Because of some of the bad we were doing. Daniela, did you want to drop something?
There's a documentary actually that came out after the Ferguson uprising about that entire area and how all of those little municipalities exist for the exact reason. So when we talk about the Ferguson decision, the Ferguson report, and what you're talking about is all those municipalities and how you can get pulled over 20 times in 20 minutes from all these different municipalities. All those little municipalities were purposely created to keep Black people from moving. And so then they would create another one, and then they would create another one, and then they would create another one to keep Black folks out of neighborhoods and make only white neighborhoods. And I'll find the name of the documentary and I'll drop it in the chat, but I did want to bring that up.
I wanted to continue this conversation on part of this representation piece. In part, we've heard from Paula and the students as an educator, but I personally did not have a Black teacher until I was in college, and I was a junior, I think, and I was at Maryland. I was no longer in Missouri. So I wanted to touch base with Representative Manlove, who went to a couple of different schools, and I think maybe saw a couple of different experiences from your general school population being different in its demographics versus, when was the first time you had a teacher that wasn't white? Because I'm telling you, I was 20 years old.
Well, unfortunately, you're kind of out in the suburbs where you grew up, but I was smack in the city.
We're out here, by the way. We exist everywhere, including
I didn't know. I did not know. But yeah, so being in the city, I had Black teachers. I think the first Black teacher I can think of is actually my librarian in elementary school. I went to E.F. Sweeney, which was a magnet school at the time. So it was still a predominantly Black school. And library, about half of the teachers were African American. But after that, I switched to the private school system and went to St. Paul's Episcopal Day School. And there was a Black lady at the front desk, and the kitchen staff, of course, was African American. But otherwise, no, there was no instructors who are African American. Then I jumped to St. Teresa's private all-girls Catholic high school. Again, nobody else except for white men and white women teaching.
Mhm.
I then jumped to Lincoln High School here in the public school system, where most of the teachers were, again, African American, because it was an African American centered school. And and back to St. Teresa's, back to no teacher. So I've had mixes of both, and it's as stereotypical as you can think. When you're in the spaces that don't have diversity, you don't talk about diverse issues unless it's, Thanksgiving or something stereotypical. And, trying to do tacos for Cinco de Mayo, which has nothing to do with Cinco de Mayo at all. So
Cinco de Mayo has nothing to do with Hispanic people at all. So there's that.
there we
also.
go. There
Yeah.
we go. So, and
Do you
then
think
in my,
possibly the different perspectives of having different teachers there could inform issues like a CRT issue that is trying to highlight and focus and pull our perspectives or other minority people perspectives into the conversation?
When the schools were integrated by federal courts, and that a phenomenon that existed from the late 1950s all the way through the end of the Missouri desegregation cases, almost up to the year 2000, it always seemed to me, I never really ran the numbers on it, but when people started talking about bringing Black children and white children to go to school together, they talked about having them have white teachers.
Mhm.
They said explicitly. But there was an assumption that they would benefit the Black children by sending them to schools with white teachers.
Mhm.
Now, in part, to be fair, that is also because the schools for white children were better resourced.
Mhm.
It wasn't just the race of the teachers, but it was also the books and all of the things that go.
And the education of the teachers. Black people weren't allowed to go to colleges in the same capacity and get some of those educational means to be able to then pass that information on down in a culturally necessary way. We have conversations about it now differently, like we're doing right now, diversity, inclusion, those sorts of things. What we're talking about in the past that has hindered so much of this progress was explicit, like you said, Judge Wolff, explicit racism. You cannot be taught, Black children will benefit being taught by white teachers, but there was no conversation that white children were going to be bused anywhere, or that Black teachers were going to be put over in white schools. Certainly not, off a natural conversation, and certainly not through forced public ways because like we were talking about earlier, certain bodies and certain minds are valued higher than others. I wanted to give Ashley an opportunity to answer that question about whether or not that representation in the teaching force you think would have some different perspective on some things like this, and then we'll open it up to questions if anyone wants to drop anything in the chat.
Well, definitely they would, because of the way that we're taught to move in this world based off of racial biases and implicity. So it would have to be that, if the teachers would have, I probably wouldn't have experienced some of the hair pulling and name calling at schools, if if they would have taught from a critical thought. We talked kind of critically because I was blessed to go to some of those private schools. We talked critically about, science and kind of maybe wordplay, things like that, but not about, ethnicity and nationalism and the things that really make us unique and beautiful.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
Thanks. So opening up any questions that may be had in the chat. I know that Barbara was leading a bit of a lively
Very robust.
Barbara, December, and Nolan are leading lively discussions in the chat box. Are there any questions that you would like to have brought up to our panelists at this time? I don't know how I can't.
I wanted to let who said I've got questions? December's got questions. I also wanted to give Representative or Senator Washington, had a good comment in the chat, and I wanted to unmute Senator Washington if she wanted to say anything at all. Barbara, just let me know. You can unmute yourself if you do want to speak. If not, just say you don't. No.
In the meantime, December, you want to pop in with your question?
Yes, I'm unmuted. I put December Thunder, but I didn't think it was really gonna let me do it. But my name is December Harmon. I had a question for Representative Brown. Who I think I met you a few weeks ago. But I had a question jumping back to the topic of 1619 project. I guess really if anyone knows, are there any schools in Missouri that we know of that adopted any parts of the, I guess the curriculum example that they have? I mean, has any school, like, is there any school that adopted any part of this subject?
Yes. So Kansas City Public uses some pieces of, according to their own discussion. So after the first hearing, that wanted to talk about banning CRT, the committee directed the Commissioner of Education to do a survey. Everyone responded. Most people said no, they weren't using any of it, but Kansas City said they were using pieces of both 1619 and CRT, I believe. Hazelwood School District uses a little bit, a very small, minute piece of the 1619. It's 2 paragraphs, and there's a comparison between something that happened, and I just breezed through it, but compared to a point in time in history and then to today, actually. And there was one other district, and I can't remember what it is. So I would not have known that until that survey came out. I can tell you that no one has adopted a full CRT curriculum because teachers have their hands full, and school districts have their hands full trying to teach the standards that we've set forth at this point.
Okay. And I had a second question. This one's a little, I guess, kind of broad in a way.
Yeah.
So I'm from New Jersey. I grew up in New Jersey, and I've never, been part of the school system.
Okay.
So, but in my earlier 20s, I was, friends with people in college, and I've repeatedly been told by my white friends that they don't, they didn't learn any kind of black history growing up. Now I know it doesn't speak to every school and all of that, but I'd say at least 2 or 3 people I've talked to on this subject. I say, hey, I want to go do Black History Month. I don't know if y'all, kind of talk about subjects like slavery and stuff like that. Does any of that happen? And I kept getting the response that, well, why would we learn about that? Why would we learn about Black people? And the way that they talked to me was that Black history was a separate subject entirely. And I was just wondering, do you know that's part of the curriculum in the Missouri school system and maybe they just missed that, or how's that work?
No, it is not. They missed it, but not because it was part of the curriculum and they just missed it. They weren't absent for February. We have a multitude of school districts who do not teach Black history. With that said, we now have some school districts who are doing, we do have some that are doing a much better job of incorporating, instead of just doing it in February, they incorporate history as it should have been all along. Whether it's date wise or topic wise. So we do have, I know that I can speak to Hazelwood, Pattonville Parkway, my school districts that I represent, they teach Black History Month. But I know that districts like Hazelwood and Riverview and some of those, they do a much better job of incorporating than they had in the past. So it is more an authentic history. They still do a bunch of Black history activities that are wonderful, but we do a better job in some of our districts than others. And I'm not calling any districts out because I don't know them all, but incorporation has gotten much better in the last 10 years. But when somebody says to you, we didn't learn that, why would we learn that? I can say to you that is an absolute fact that there are a multitude of school districts who do not even teach Black History Month.
And I just want to point out that, every time you say Black history, white people were there, and white people are often many of the reasons why those points in Black history are the things that we study. It is often the, commodification of MLK quotes to say people on literally side of whatever that side is. Some of those harder will use MLK's words as though, the teaching of the rest of his words and the rest of his philosophy and the celebration of his birthday and conversations of his death as though he passively died in his sleep and was not murdered for assassinated for the things that he was saying. There is that retelling and that every year you see that cycle of how our history is being whitewashed in the present as it is happening right in front of us. Judge,
can I follow up on that?
Please.
Because history is history, and as you pointed out, white people were there too. So instead of, it seems to me that it segments it arbitrarily to call something Black history. I'm not just talking about schools. I'm not against Black history as such, but it seems to me that one of the ways you could test whether history is being taught is, for example, when did you first hear about the Tulsa Race Massacre? When did you first hear about the East St. Louis Race Massacre? 1917, by the way. So are there events in history that are very significant to the history of a state or a region or the country that haven't been taught? I grew up in Minnesota, and in fourth grade, we studied Minnesota history. It wasn't until I was past college that I read that 38 Indians were hanged in Mankato, Minnesota. I mean, so we erase the history we don't want to, that we don't want to study, because we don't want people to feel like we're bad people or that our country's a bad place.
No guilt.
It is a place with human beings. And you can study the history of any country and see the kinds of things that but what that does is that maybe people will say, well, if you teach it that way, then you're denying American exceptionalism because we're so exceptional. Well, maybe people can draw their own conclusions. Let's just study the facts. And in some respects, yes, we are exceptional. In other respects, we're exceptionally bad.
Yeah, as someone who has foreign parents, I've always been able to zoom out a little bit, and I always say every country has their own weird race shit. You know what I mean? It's not, I cannot be an American and point at Haiti or the Dominican Republic and be like, well, you're doing your racism wrong. We have to acknowledge that a lot of them have been inspired and have gotten a lot of a lot of how they have incorporated into their country and culture from how we were able to do so in ours. And I think Representative Manlove, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was gonna say, ditto to everything you guys have said, but December, a lot of my charter schools are actually starting to teach a full scope of history. Whether you like charter schools or not, that's part of that. That's part of that flexibility in the curriculum training that they do good about, well, at least the ones here in Kansas City that are in my district. And so it's starting to become, and I think it's because it has become such a, mainstream topic again, that they actually use, how did the George Floyd make you feel kind of things. So even if they're not going back into history or specifically teaching critical race theory, I think there are some changes that are popping up in curriculum to make the kids think more worldview and to embrace their own, kind of ideas and feelings into their own personal worldviews.
And I want to, again, let anyone come up with any question or concern that they want to pop into the chat at all. But I wanted to follow up and say, this is a hard conversation for everyone at a lot of levels. I will say Princeton, for example, just within the last 5 years created an African-American studies program, just very recently. And this is an Ivy League that does, whatever and such and such. So these are, every time I leave Missouri, I defend her with all of my heart, and we can talk about her because we want her to be great. But we are not the only ones having these conversations, and not the only ones struggling with how do we teach our proper place in history? How do we advance that so that we can progress, so all of us can have good education, have a roof over our head, have a good job, be able to give our kids a good education, have some food in the fridge. That I think are the universal things that we're all trying to get to at the end of the day, and trying to move and maneuver around these barriers and hindrances that doesn't take us to a colorblind society, but also doesn't take us to a black and white society like it was before, but embraces, even during slavery, there were Native Americans, there were Asian people, there were Mexican folks. Half of the country was not the country that it is right now. The conversation of American exceptionalism and that everything was not manifest destiny and was just entitled to be ours is a conversation worth having, and something that I'm happy to see being explored more in schools than it was when I was there. But it's hard to push back on those things, like Ashley was saying, when you are the diversity in a classroom and you are the spokesperson for everything that is not the people around you. Judge Wolff, did you want to make a comment?
When you brought up Princeton, I thought it was interesting that Princeton, before he was president of the United States, Woodrow Wilson was president of Princeton University.
Princeton, yep, and they want to rename it because he did horrible things.
Well, when he was president, he eliminated the last vestiges of the Reconstruction era, which allowed the hiring of blacks in the federal service and so forth. I mean, he's one of the great heroes of American presidency, and he was about as racist a man as you could find.
Yeah,
I think that's that's my opinion, but I think the facts will bear that out.
I know people at Princeton were having those types of conversations at those times as well. You're not the only one to have that thought. But again, and that is a change that happened because of the generations of Black people that have gone through Princeton. And, that is a small example and just one of the schools doing one of the things. But we have our own Missouri X-Rail Gaines, I think was our case, that we had to integrate our law schools because we would not teach, as you were saying earlier, Judge Wolff, we would not teach black and white together. And that was a fight for K through 12. That was a fight for work. That was a fight for higher ed. That is continued to be a fight over and over again. And we are just seeing the vestiges of that fight now.
You're absolutely correct. And the NAACP folks who brought the Missouri case saw that as a lead up to going into the elementary and secondary education thing. And the way Missouri solved the problem of providing legal education to Black students was to pay for them to go to school out of state.
Yep.
And then there was the formation of Lincoln Law School in St. Louis, which was a Black law school, that was in business until I think the 1960s, somewhere in there.
Mhm.
So yeah, so we kept it separate because they said, well, if you're not going to let them into the University of Missouri, then you're going to have to
Pay for them to
provide
go out
something
of state
else,
somewhere.
do something else, or provide another law school, which probably was. And I think it's quite obvious that it was not as resourced as the University of
Right.
Missouri.
Right.
And still is not.
Yeah.
Lincoln University is still,
No, it wasn't Lincoln and Jefferson City, but you're correct to make that observation. This Lincoln Law School was in St. Louis, and I'm not sure it was affiliated with Lincoln University in Jeff City.
Justin,
so,
oh, I'm sorry, Danielle, go ahead.
well, Ronald Nelson had a question, I think kind of a succinct answer, or a succinct question is, there's been a lot of discussion about critical race theory, but what exactly is it? Why is it the thing right now? And I know we kind of touched on that, but in like a succinct, like for me, when I look at it as the Southern strategy rebooted. But I don't know everyone else's thoughts on that.
I think that's definitely a way to look at how it is being rolled out. But what CRT really truly is just history from more perspectives. That is all that it is. It is history being taught with the perspectives of more people that were there or around or affected by what happened at that time. That is truly all that it is.
Particularly the ones that were actually oppressed.
Yeah. And it started as an overview of the legal system and has turned into self-proclaimedly so by people on the opposing side of this issue that they want this to be a thunderstorm, a lightning rod for people, where if there's anything that they don't like or don't care about being taught to their schools, or any sort of racial implication of any guilt or shame or any questioning of privilege or questioning of something that makes them uncomfortable, can be categorized in this seemingly innocuous, again, I just told you what it is, it's just history. But if it is couched in CRT, Judge Wolff discussed, you put critical in front of stuff, that'll make people think twice about it, and couched it in this scary euphemism that has all these people up in arms. But when you really look at some of the language that has been introduced and some of the things that would be banned, it is scary. We're talking like, it's like McCarthy, like the some of the worst things that you can imagine of the stuff that we've done in this country, especially as it pertains to the First Amendment, like of thought, and that was for things people's beliefs, and now we're arguing about the facts, literally just the facts of history, not even what is your philosophical belief. What happened on December 7th, 1941 is the question, and we're arguing over the answers repeatedly for so many major parts of our history. So I would say CRT is just history from more perspectives.
So I'd like to jump in here.
Go ahead.
I have been looking into the background of all of this. And so I have a quote for you that was very, very interesting. I don't know if any of you know who Christopher Rufo is, but he's a prominent opponent who works for the Right Wing Manhattan Institute.
Mm-hmm.
And so when people say, why has this become a thing? This is a political weapon.
Mm-hmm.
This really has nothing to do with education. It is a political weapon. And I'm going to read a quote. And he put it out on Twitter. So it became public.
Mm-hmm.
We've successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all of the various cultural insanities under the brand category. The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory.
Mm-hmm.
This political agenda is being pushed by, especially in Missouri, the Show Me Institute, who's really about privatizing education.
Yep. All
of education.
Yep.
So if we tie the hands of public educators and we get parents and whoever else is angry enough, then they get their legislators to try to defund education even more and spend public tax dollars to private institutions. Mm-hmm. So SEAM, I don't know if any of you know who they are, but they are the folks who like the charter schools and the vouchers. They have been supporting this movement as well, which is interesting because they also highlight their schools to be the way to help Black and brown children. where public schools are not helping them.
Mhm.
But now they have this other thing going on, which we know is not going to help Black and brown children. It's not going to help any children. So that's what this is.
Mhm.
This is political weaponization of public schools.
Mhm.
There's a 2-page list of words that these
Yeah.
folks have put out that says if this is talked about in your schools, this is critical race theory. Things like equity, diversity, parity,
Mhm.
race,
Mhm.
gender, all of those words have now become weaponized
Yeah.
for their political agenda to ruin public education.
Yep.
At the just the ground floor of it.
Absolutely. No, that's
So
very,
I hope I answered that.
thank you.
You know, go ahead.
Go ahead, Judge Wolff, and then I'm gonna round it out with Justice's
One
question
little,
and then
one
closing.
little anecdote. When I was working with Governor Carnahan in the 90s, we were working on legislation to transition, because the courts were going to get out of the desegregation business. And we had the thought, and it went on for several years, that this funding mechanism, we took the impacted poverty money, we put the DSEG money into that and distributed on the basis of poverty rather than the basis of race. And the Commissioner of Education and I were testifying in a House committee hearing, and there was a young legislator from the Boot Heel who asked this question very sincerely, because it said that, you know, there would be schools in rural areas of the state which would get, if they had high poverty populations, would get more money. And he said, if we make the schools better, who will do the work?
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Yeah, that's gross.
That was a question. So you think things are bad now? They were back then too.
Yeah, no,
They sometimes did the right thing, but it was still kind of bad.
you bring up a good point that this is a continuing fight and struggle. Barbara just popped on. I'm sorry, Senator Washington just popped on. I want to go ahead and allow you to pop in here briefly.
Hi, I didn't know I was speaking. I just wanted to support my chairwoman and my friends. Thank you all for putting this on. I think and I stepped out, I apologize. So I agree totally with Representative Brown that this is just something that is going to be used to weaponize the defunding of public schools. I'm probably, except for Judge Wolff, one of the only people on here who has a parent or knows specifically about legalized segregation. My mom actually graduated from high school in 1948. And that was a time and that for my generation and above and before would have meant that we always had Black teachers, because that's the only people that would teach us. And also that is in time when that's the only thing Black women were allowed to do, either be a teacher or a nurse. But oddly enough, since my mother has passed, my aunt revealed to us that in high school, my grandfather was a Methodist minister, so they moved back and forth between Missouri and Kansas, that they actually went to integrated schools for a little while in Kansas before 1954. And in Manhattan, which is where they were, they actually did go to integrated schools. And I believe Judge Wolff had mentioned that it wasn't necessarily that the school was better, but the resources were much better. The coursework that they were allowed to take was much better. So if we bring that forward to critical race theory, it's imperative that those of us who know, first of all, I have 3 degrees and I don't have a full understanding of what it is. And it was never taught in my undergraduate years. And I went to the best journalism school in the world. I always say that. And I have a law degree and an MBA, and those are not theories that we talked about or went through. So it's imperative that we keep the narrative as to exactly what that is. And that is not something in K through 12. And we have to pull in our partners in the rural community so that they know that this is not just going to defund and continue to allow white folks to not go to school with Black folks. Because myself and Representative Manlove are both alumni of a school district that is still, even after federal case law, federal lawsuits that said desegregate, the Kansas City School District is still above 80% Black in a city that's only 26% Black. So it's imperative that we have to let our rural people know it's not just going to let white folks go to school away from Black folks, which is really what they want to do, but it's also going to mean that there won't be enough money for our rural communities, which are already suffering from education. So that's just kind of my little take on it, and what we need to do to continue. Part of the steps that we need to continue to take to let it be known that this is a political farce. This is just a way to defund public education, especially the way we know it. And in Kansas City, it will really hurt our kids because we already have House Bill 349, and that's not enough. That credit of, I think it's $67.50 or something like that. There really aren't high schools on the Kansas City side that kids can go to for that.
Thank you for bringing up, first of all, for participating, bringing your voice, bringing your support. We appreciate you. Any of the panelists want to round this out with some thoughts about what Senator Washington had? If anyone has time, I'd love to jump to Justice. I know you had a question you wanted to toss in there, and then we can close it out.
By the way, Senator Washington, for the record, I was graduated from high school after 1948. So
good. That's what I was going to say. That was my guess.
He knows I know that. I was just saying that he probably hands-on understood what we meant by segregated schools. In fact, one other little tidbit, and Mo, you had mentioned about white kids getting bused to Black schools. And in fact, many don't realize that the desegregation fight in Kansas City actually began in the 70s. So I do remember when I was in the 5th grade that white kids were bused to my school, which was definitely unusual because it's usually Black kids being bused.
I mean, in my high school, we had Black kids bust in at some point the year after I graduated in like 08.
But so we had white kids bused to the hood school.
Yeah. I mean, it's still happening in so many directions. Judge Wolff?
We had part of the evidence in the Kansas City school desegregation case was that the books that the Black schools got were hand-me-downs from the white schools. I mean, so when you talk about resources, that becomes very real. And that is, the white schools did have the good stuff. And, even with desegregation, when they started setting up magnet schools in St. Louis, now Kansas City tried to make everything a magnet school.
Which was stupid.
Yeah, but what they do is it's sort of like a board where you've got some things rolling around on the board. They tilted the resources toward the magnet schools because they wanted to show that the only way you could really do this is to have magnet schools, which had more money and stuff like that. So some of the other schools that were not magnet schools got shorted. And there's a real hero of mine over in Kansas City that I met who ran the JS Chick Elementary School, because she had a school that was 100%.
Mother Ballard.
Yes, 100% African-American.
Miss Ballard.
Yes, she was terrific. And if the school district sent her a teacher she didn't think was any good, she sent them back. It was very tough. And they had kids, the kids there wore uniforms, they lined up. It reminded me of my days in a Catholic grade school. In fact, I closed my eyes and I thought, wait a minute, am I in the right place? Are there nuns around here someplace?
Justice, you want to go ahead and ask your question and we can round this out?
Yeah, I figured since I was closing us out, I'd go ahead and wrap it up together.
Go ahead.
This has been an amazing conversation, first of all.
I agree.
I'm listening to everything. Just like Ashley, I went to spend some time at St. Teresa's. That's where I graduated. But before there, I was at Central Middle, and then went to Genesis School, what's called the alternative school. Did not want to go there at all. Cried because I didn't want to go there. So glad I did. Why? Because I learned about a book called The Spook Who Sat by the Door, which was a banned movie. It was the first time I was exposed to Angela Davis, and I read Women, Race, and Class. I also read a book called That Came Before Columbus, The
Mhm.
Miseducation of the Negro,
Mhm.
right? And so I was in that space, immersed, and there were mostly Black educators in that space who was giving this knowledge to young people. I talk to a lot of people now, and they do not know these books. They're
Mhm.
like, what, huh, who, what, you were exposed to what? Mamie Isler, God bless the dead, sent her teachers to Africa and said, you will do your in-service for the entire summer. I need you to understand where our children come from. I need you to understand that history. And so I say that because along with the history of Lucille Bluford, who was denied entry into MU,
Mhm.
the woman who was the editor of The Call, the Black newspaper here in Kansas City. This is the history that we're talking about, not saying nothing about, y'all.
Mhm.
This right here. The and so to the other point about the distraction, yes, this is. But I also want to make the point that this distraction is being used as a tool
Mhm.
to effectively silence us and to erase our history.
Mhm.
And so one of the things that we want to make sure that we do is make sure that people understand that it is not a distraction to ignore.
Mhm.
It is not one of those things where we say, oh, that's a distraction, and people go about their business and keep doing their work.
Mhm.
We want to make sure that we address this and anything that comes up through that ledger that will have an impact. Why? Why? For our children.
Mhm.
For our children. I got an 8-year-old little boy, a 16-year-old daughter, and a 21-year-old son. And I know some of you have children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, and we want them to have a quality education. We want them to go into the world knowing, right? And not with a cloud, and not with some inflated sense of I'm superior. And for our Black babies, not with a deflated sense of I'm inferior. So that is why this is critical. And so I just wanted to make those comments because we all were hitting on so many things, and we could continue these discussions. But for people who are out there and are listening and want to become involved, please reach out to us. I'm talking to a group of students and getting them together. Why? Because they reached out to me.
Mhm.
They reached out to me. They said, this is important.
To us.
We want to know what y'all gonna do.
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
for our students, we're gathering. If there are young people, college students, high school students, I don't care, middle school students. And if you want to have a voice in this, Danielle is going to be doing some work, making some videos. We're going to be doing some other things. Please reach out to the ACLU. We will drop a link of something that you can sign up for under this. But also we want to talk to parents
Mhm.
and we want to talk to educators. Highly important. And so I just want to thank all of our guests tonight for speaking your truth, for telling it like it is. I've been writing, no, y'all see me. I was in the car, I'm here now. And it's just been a pretty full conversation.
Yes.
And we need to keep it up. So thank you so much. Thank you, Mo.
Thank you so much to our panelists, to our audience members. This has, as Justice said, been a robust conversation. I look forward to continuing. Like Justice said, the ACLU will continue to have a couple of series into the fall to prepare us for testimony that I imagine will come before the spring break this year, probably January or February at some point. And so we will continue conversations with the representatives, with Judge Wolff. And hopefully you all will continue rocking with us at the ACLU and continuing our trainings, our testimony. Like Justice said, we cannot ignore this. And like our good panelists have told us, there are myriad reasons why. But thank you so much for this conversation. I have learned a lot, and I have couldn't think of a better way to spend my Tuesday. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.